Hello, little friends. It's time for our bedtime story by Anne Perellis. Tonight we have a funny and silly tale to share, full of mischief and surprises. It's a story about two very tricky characters, Mr. and Mrs. Twit, from the Twits by Roald Dahl. So snuggle up, get comfy, and let's dive into the world of these two naughty folks. Mr. and Mrs. Twit were not nice people at all. In fact, they were the kind of people who loved to make others miserable. They lived in a house that looked as unpleasant as they were, with cobwebs and dirt everywhere. Mr. Twit was tall and very, very scruffy. His beard was long, thick, and full of old bits of food. He had a mean, crooked smile and loved playing nasty tricks. Mrs. Twit was just as bad. She had a huge, ugly nose, and her favourite thing in the world was to make mischief, too. One of their favourite tricks was to play pranks on each other. They didn't treat each other kindly, and they would often do horrible things to make the other one angry. For example, Mr. Twit loved to put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed, and Mrs. Twit? She would hide her husband's walking stick just to make him search all over the house for it. But do you know what made them even more terrible? Their faces! You see, Mr. and Mrs. Twit had such horrible, mean expressions on their faces all the time that their faces became, well, stuck like that. Mr. Twit's face was twisted and ugly, with a constant, nasty grin. Mrs. Twit's face was so sour it looked like she'd been sucking on lemons her whole life. Their faces were just as miserable as their hearts. But things were about to change. You see, the Twits had a lot of animals. They kept them in cages, and they didn't treat them kindly at all. The monkeys were in a cage outside, and the birds, well, they were all caged up inside the house. One day, the animals had enough. The clever monkeys and the wise birds decided it was time to teach the Twits a lesson. They began planning their revenge. First, the monkeys tricked the Twits by making them think that the monkey cage was falling apart. The Twits rushed outside to see what was happening. But when they got there, the monkeys had already hidden, giggling at their foolishness. Next, the birds joined in. They started making noises and distractions to confuse Mr. and Mrs. Twit. Slowly but surely, their plan was coming together. Then came the grand moment. The animals pulled off their final trick. The Twits' house was turned upside down, quite literally. The monkeys had made the roof look like the floor, and the Twits were left in a state of complete confusion, spinning around in their own house. At last, Mr. and Mrs. Twit got the message. They had been playing tricks on others for so long that they had forgotten how it felt to be the ones tricked. The animals had taught them a lesson they would never forget. And so, the Twits, with their faces still twisted in their awful grins, learned that being nasty and playing tricks on others is never the right way to live. The animals, on the other hand, learned that sometimes the best revenge is simply showing kindness and cleverness. Now, as we drift off to sleep, let's remember that being kind, funny, and clever is far better than playing mean tricks. We all have the power to choose our actions, and kindness will always win in the end. Good night, little ones. Sleep tight. And may you dream of fun adventures and sweet dreams. Sweet dreams until the next bedtime story.